It's great to be back here, though actually slightly triggering, because I covered the Edinburgh International TV Festival for about 25 years. So finding myself in the Morphot room having to give a talk to journalists, it sort of makes me feel like it's a very bad dream, but I'll try to make sure that that's not the case. Oh, maybe it is a bad dream. So first of all, I really want to thank Jeff and Benoit and their teams for inviting me here, and thank you for listening to me for the next 20 minutes or so. I spent a long time in my professional life covering broadcasting policy, which I thought was very exciting at the time. And now at the Tower Centre in Columbia Journalism School, one of our key areas of study is the effect that digital disruption is having on journalism. And this afternoon, I'm going to try and bring those things closer together. And in fact, I'm sort of the embodiment, if you would, of Facebook. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and provoke you with some adversarial language. I'm going to subliminally persuade you with some shoddy images that I've stolen off the internet, that aren't actually mine. And then I'm going to psychologically manipulate you to take a course of action that you quite possibly might not be in your best interest. So I hope you're prepared for all of that. It is an incredibly interesting time, I think, to be a public service broadcaster. And I know what you're thinking, which is save us from interesting times. Nevertheless, you're actually some of the most resilient media entities in the world. At a time when our public communications commons are being devoured, on the one hand by large-scale technology platforms, search engine companies, and on the other side by increasingly worryingly authoritarian regimes that seem to be on the rise around the world. Public media organisations, I know it's not easy for everybody in that category, but they are some of the few institutions that can actually play a role in holding both of those rising pressures to account and to a higher standard. At the moment, we're living in a giant experiment to see what happens when you completely dissolve the certainties of a news environment. So the certainty of advertiser-funded journalism has gone. The certainty of a stable regulatory environment has gone. The certainty of a public record, reliable public record, is going, if not yet gone. The certainty that the market will provide an answer to all of these if we just keep innovating hard enough, I think, has gone. And the certainty that you can tell where your news is coming from and who made it and how it reached you and why it reached you, that certainty has gone. We know where it's gone. I do apologise because you've all seen these slides 100 times. I like to show them to my students at the beginning of any talk about what's happening in news. These are total newsroom jobs in America. I know it's America, but this is, I think, probably very familiar territory for most people in the room. Over the course of the last 25 years or so, down from 60-odd thousand right down to under 35,000. Where have they gone? Well, this is the number of jobs that Alphabet or Google has added just between 2007 and 2017. I don't know if you read it last week, but there was a great article by Ken Doctor on Neiman Lab, where he was noting that he estimated that the entire newspaper sector in the States makes a profit of about $1.5 billion, and that's everybody, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. So compare that to the probably $12 billion in profit that Google will make by itself this year. And you can see why, if you like, the crisis has occurred, or rather why it's so difficult for us to fix it. The crisis is much worse in the US, I think, than it might be, just because of the very low level of funding for public media. Yet actually the public media outlets, both PBS and NPR and their affiliate stations, are holding up incredibly well, both in terms of trust ratings and in terms of sustainability, despite the Trump administration's moves to cut their funding. I think now it is an incredibly important time for public and civic media. And in fact, one of the reasons I was asked to talk here was because I'd said something slightly rash about, I think it's more important, civic media now is more important than it has been at any point in the previous 50 years. And I was asked, well, come and explain what you mean by that. So I'm going to try, because I think that what we're facing is not just a commercial failure in the media sector, but it's a civic failure on the part of the platforms who we thought would be ever more the gatekeepers. I think that this failure, both of commercial news and of civic platforms, opens up an enormous opportunity for public media. I know you hate the word opportunity, but think of it instead as an urgent mandate. So in other words, you are some of the few organisations that can actually make a difference to this. And unlike in America, in Europe, at least you don't have to start from scratch in building your own news environment. A few years ago, I don't think anybody believed that platform power would be a key driver of anti-democratic forces. Well, some of us did, but I know that not many people believed it because those of us who've talked about it for quite a long time, and I have to say there's a whole generation of scholars who talked about it before me, largely weren't believed, or we were just ignored, and people just assumed that the shroud waving, as somebody once described it about Facebook, was alarmist. Nobody believed a few years ago that the market failure for journalism would be systemic rather than cyclical, and very few imagined that we would have quite as much credibility or even sort of suggestions, even in America, of the kinds of new regulation that we might need around expression and speech, and the kinds of positive regulation we might need around funding journalism. So, on the ground, reporting we know is dwindling, along with the advertising money that supported it. The rapidly growing platforms are providing an unchecked environment for populism, opaque political campaigning, and now it seems stochastic terrorism. For those of you who, I'm sure you all know, because you're all in news, know what stochastic terrorism is, but it's the violence that arises from repeated messages of hatred that fuel radicalization. In 2 years, the platforms have gone from this. So this is one of my favourite shots from the internet that I stole from the internet. This is the plaque that YouTube gave InfoWars for passing 1 million subscribers. So that was a couple of years ago. To this year, which is the war room at Facebook that they set up to combat misinformation as it circulated ahead of the midterm elections. I love the juxtaposition of those two things. I think they demonstrate a great deal of irony in the situation we find ourselves in today. It's not just an American thing. I will talk a little bit more about the midterms in a minute, because all of those of us who have lived through the American election cycle for the last 2 years can't stop talking about it. You've probably noticed that. And in fact, I noticed that when I was watching the BBC at my mum's house this week, you can't stop talking about it either. But it's the same story everywhere. It's not just in America. In Brazil, we had Bolsonaro winning the national elections with campaigns orchestrated through WhatsApp and other social media. In India, Modi's populist BJP party ran very similar campaigns through 1,000 different closed WhatsApp groups. In the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte has boosted his popularity by using an influencer network of fanatical followers on Facebook, whilst simultaneously cracking down on the independent press. We're 2 years past Brexit and the US presidential elections, and we still don't really have any certainty about what exactly happened in the expenditure on political advertising and different sort of propagandistic interventions then. I think, you know, if you just put a pin in a map at the moment, Hungary, Italy, Sri Lanka, wherever, you stand a very good chance of finding democratic processes being uprooted, in part, at least, by the communications commons. The old-fashioned mantra of authoritarianism has always been invert the truth, discredit the press. And now our largest communication and search platforms are helping the populist governments do exactly that. Facebook was condemned by the UN for its part in the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. Last week, I don't know how many people here have had a chance to read the 62-page document that Facebook commissioned on its, if you like, its internal inquiry to examine what it should do in the face of all this. Its recommendations to itself were pretty much a public media playbook. It suggested have people on the ground who understand local audiences, who understand the political context and the levels of media literacy, have language skills that can scale to what is being hosted, introduced ground-level fact-checking, and import journalism projects from other markets. So effectively, they were just describing, if you like, public media or how it should have been built before the technology was introduced in the way it was. When social platforms operate anywhere with no understanding of publishing responsibility and with few guardrails around process or content, it leads to toxicity. When they do so in a country of low media literacy, heightened political tensions and rapidly spreading technology, the results are catastrophic. For many years, I would be in rooms with people from Facebook saying, we simply don't understand why it is important to distinguish between us being a platform or being a publisher. Why is this important? Well, if Facebook had seen itself as a publisher, then its role in Myanmar would never have happened. But it's not just platforms either. News organizations are having to learn how to adapt in this incredibly dynamic environment, and we're not always doing a very good job, as perhaps the midterms demonstrated. This is a great quote from my research director, Jonathan Albright. Rumors sin fronteras, he describes it. As he says, the legitimization of the narrative happens by commanding a critical mass of attention. It's reinforced in click-seeking mainstream headlines and fact-checks through keyword repetition. It's platformless. So if we take, for instance, the example of the migrant caravan that never was, or rather it was, but it should not have been the story that dominated the news cycle all the way up to the American midterms, stoking a fear of immigration, giving the president a platform of talking points. It started off actually as long ago as last March as a hashtag with various activists sort of fanning it. But it really took off in the weeks before the election. Here is Lou Dobbs, who is actually a Fox anchor, who is asking on Twitter, do you think that the radical left had a role in financing this caravan? And here's what happened in mainstream news coverage of that story, which is, bear in mind that this was never really the story it was portrayed to be. Fox News, which has the largest viewing figures, led with the story, and everybody else followed. We are really not very good at understanding how to avoid the pitfalls of media when it is manipulated in this way. This is a tweet which has some great facts in it. Height of the network's coverage on Fox News, you have 310 mentions on one particular day of the caravan. Week before election day, 204 mentions. Day after the election, 16 mentions. And what replaced it was talking about Jim Acosta in the presidential press conference, which again was a piece of theatre that we all cannot resist covering, and yet which doesn't necessarily serve an independent news agenda particularly well. And the New York Times ran a piece talking about this is the real-life consequences, if you like, of these stories becoming, melded, the message becoming melded into real-world action, is that there are still 1,000 troops at the border waiting for this caravan to arrive, which is still many miles away from the border. And then, of course, you know, worse than that, the talking points of all of those stories showed up in the Twitter feed of the pipe bomber, who indeed addressed his pipe bombs to CNN and George Soros and Democratic politicians as well. So when I talk about stochastic terrorism, often in the West we think about this happening in the Middle East, or it's something that we have to worry about different populations becoming radicalized. It's actually happening right now in America. Same thing with the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh just before the election. So, political campaigns we know are riddled with hyper-targeted messages sent by candidates or political interest groups, and they're indistinguishable often from news, flattened out by the design protocols of public media, sorry, not public media, that's you, of platforms. Ideas that foment at the margins, whether it's on Twitch or Reddit or 4chan or WhatsApp or wherever, pick your platform, they end up, if you like, sort of being fanned into de facto propaganda by the government. And I don't need to rehearse for this audience what the effects on journalism have been everywhere. There's a local crisis of resource, there's a national crisis of trust and integrity, and there's a global crisis of press freedom. Journalists are targets everywhere, from downtown Annapolis, with 5 people killed at the Capital Gazette shooting last year, to Saudi Arabia. It would be easy to despair, but that is, as I say, despair is not something we have the luxury of being able to do. So instead we have to try and fix it. I think this is a mission which needs the resources and engagement of the technology platforms. I'd like to think that we could do it without them, but I don't think we can. But it also needs the leadership in civic media standards, in high-quality journalism, in transparency, in both communicating and practicing accountability. So I'm sure you've heard all this before. But I think it's possible to do it now in a way that perhaps it was not possible to do it before. Why? Why is it possible now? Well, so I think the failings of social platforms, as we saw through Myanmar and the involvement of Facebook there, have become a major focus of political and journalistic pressure, and they're having to shift their attitude as a result, and some of their business practices as well. And they're even becoming they're coming under pressure from their own workers internally. So this was a Google walkout last week, happening in New York and San Francisco, and where they have offices elsewhere, I think in Europe too, saying that they've had enough of how the company is handling sexual harassment. Secondly, I think we know now that we are not waiting for a market solution, because there isn't one. So our business model, if you like, is part of the problem. So how should public media organisations work with platform companies? I know that you've heard this before and probably had endless discussions about it. So I think that we need policies and technologies that address the market failure of journalistic organisations and the civic failure of platform companies. But we need these to be collective. It needs to be collective bargaining and collaborative effort driven by clear view of what the public interest is. I think it will also require change on the part of many public service organisations themselves. You have to relinquish the command and control model of the past. You have to work with other people. You sometimes have to cede power to be able to succeed in this world. Forging partnerships that look much more like networked progress, I think, will be important. I'm thrilled to see all sorts of efforts in that, of that type working. Local democracy reporters here is being replicated in various places in the States. I think that's a very interesting initiative. But don't underestimate the importance of institutional strength and the importance it has in sustaining journalism. So with many digitally native companies, we now see them struggling to survive. Just as the New York Times was announcing record figures for its subscriptions, we were hearing that other companies like Vox.com, which have been held up as being a pioneer of the digitally native companies, was actually having to cut its forecasts. So there's great value in having legacy, which again is something that I think we didn't think would be the case a few years ago. So I think that the opportunity for public service broadcasters to actually lead in the recasting of the public sphere exists right now, but I think it might only be brief, so you only have a narrow window of opportunity. The technology companies are already rather clumsily, I would say, trying to do civics by trying to retrofit public service values into their capitalist structures. I think we should welcome the efforts while recognising actually that independent journalism needs to be stronger and needs to have a life away from these superstructures as well. In America and Europe, we've seen a lot of deliberate engagement by Silicon Valley in how to fix journalism. So everything from Google DNI, which is now being exported to the States, Electionland, which was fact-checking the election last week, was partially funded by and had a Google presence in it. We have the Facebook Journalism Project, which, if you spend a lot of time talking to local publishers in the States, has a very mixed reputation because it seems as though everybody is waiting for the life raft to arrive and there possibly aren't enough of them quite yet. Google is partially funding a Reporters on the Ground initiative called Report for America, the idea that you take 1,000 reporters and put them into local newsrooms. This is all directly involving itself, if you like, in shaping the future of a kind of civic type of journalism. Facebook's journalism project, as I say, is erratic, but may bear more fruit in the future. In Twitter, we have Jack Dorsey, the chief executive, who's been asking for proposals as to how to clean up the discourse on his platform. And at Apple, we have a fully formed newsroom now, which is editing stories and presenting them to an audience of about 70 million. So I think that when you see, if you like, platforms beginning to pick up this responsibility, I think it's an even more sort of urgent that public service organisations step in. We see this sort of emerging network of new players, often underpinned by the structures of big tech, and they're working on this rebuilding of local journalism, which is a very creditable aim. Philanthropists, foundations, readers are all pitching money into this new movement as well. But tech companies being a key source of funding really creates, I think, problems. The funding lacks transparency. It asks us to ignore the issue as to whether it's healthy or appropriate to have companies which are also part of the surveillance economy participating so directly in journalism. Facebook and Google mostly help journalism in as much as it benefits their own platforms. Journalism efforts sponsored by companies are often about fact-checking and rooting out malign content on the platforms that they either can't or won't identify themselves. I think there's this kind of a bloat in what I'd call middleware, which is the fact-checking, the initiatives around engagement, etc. All of this is fine, but it's ignoring the fact that you need to fund journalism. You need to fund editors and you need to fund reporters. Google, for example, uses its International News Guys conference to convene the news industry and invariably steers the roadmap for news towards rather nebulous concepts around truth and trust. They help shape some of the investment and innovation priorities for the industry on the back of these discussions, be it search engine optimization or mending trust by providing a fact-checking layer, or even by helping by deploying their own AI into newsrooms. Some of this is valuable work. I'm not saying it's not, but it does ignore the urgent need for reporting and editing. Many of the assumptions, I think, made by technology companies about what would improve the information climate are poorly formed and inadequately tested. So if we're being charitable, at least we would say they are trying, but the truth is we are being dragged along by their agenda and fixes, rather than robustly engaging them in a long-term project to secure independent public service journalism. And to my mind, the money they're committing to fixing this, if you like, news environmental climate change is simply not enough. They are just not paying enough money. So what would a strong public service set of demands, what's the manifesto that you are being given by platforms actually looking like? Well, there are a few points that you could take from here. Well-defined codes of content which are consistently applied, transparency and accountability about decisions and enforcement. If they're not going to be the arbiters of truth, then they should be allowing for public service filters and algorithms that can be applied to their content so somebody can be the arbiters of truth. Design principles that favour clear branding and the provenance of news should be implemented. And improved access to data. Yes, improved access to data for all of you in this room so that you can actually analyse what's happening to the audience and what's happening to your stories more closely, but also to researchers and to journalists so that we can actually see what is happening much more quickly to the public sphere and its health. In the fragmented digital environment, public service media and journalism can survive if it has high quality independent journalism that reaches people effectively in a format they can engage with. Platforms and search companies must respond to the idea of a different hierarchy of information than the faulty design they currently have. They can fund but not control the rebuilding of public service journalism through innovation, funding the basics, and working with experienced and trusted news organisations. What leverage do you media companies have? I would say much more now than you think. One thing platforms are increasingly vulnerable to is pressure from quality independent news outlets and regulators. In the Ofcom report released earlier this year about the future of public service broadcasting, the UK regulator talked vaguely about more collaborative and collective bargaining. I would go further and say that with the right type of collective action, public service media companies could develop a very strong negotiating position. Supposing there was a serious suggestion of withdrawal of content from platforms, unless they agree to implement measures that help public service journalism. No third-party fact-checking for free, no news brands or individuals promoting stories on platforms or news feeds, a removal of high-quality content that counterbalances the tides of dubious commercial and political material. If all the news workers that post, tailor, respond and engage on platforms stopped, it is just possible that the slow progress so far made by only unilateral negotiations would dramatically speed up. An epistemic strike would be a startling wake-up call to the large technology companies. I think it is a remote possibility, but I certainly do not think that organising organisations like the EBU should rule it out. More than shaking up Silicon Valley, public service media organisations would signal to governments and to the public that they serve that they have a relevance and a role in an environment where the popular view was not that long ago that their institutional relevance was waning and that their place in the news environment was under inevitable threat. By their own naivety and negligence, platform companies have created a powerful manifesto for those invested in public service media. I'm surprised in a way that public media organisations have not emerged as more of a force when reshaping both the responsibilities of platforms and the future for public media. I think the people in this room can change that with your own innovations and with consistent collective pressure on the platforms. I want to end on a slightly more hopeful note and a battle cry from a very brave woman. Last week, the founder of Rappler, Maria Ressa, was awarded the Knight International Journalism Award. She was also coincidentally, almost on the same day that she picked up the award, the victim of a threatened indictment for trumped-up tax charges by Rodrigo Duterte's government, who have been trying their hardest to silence her journalism. I want to end with a message that Maria delivered to social platforms and to journalists. To the social media platforms, she said, "Your business model has divided societies and weakened democracies. Personalization says my reality is different from yours, and we can all have our realities. But all of these realities have to coexist in the public sphere. You can't tear us apart to the point that we don't agree on the facts. Why? Why should you allow lies to spread? Yes, it's a great responsibility, but this is not a matter of free speech. It's a gatekeeping role once wielded by human journalists. And as we have seen time and again, online hate leads to real-world violence. Consider making the same tough business decisions our little company made to protect the public sphere and ensure democracy survives." To journalists and activists who continue to fight, we have to stay the course. Sometimes people say we're naive or foolish. We're not. These times require that because without hope, we have no energy to move forward. So we have to take the long view and work together. No, we're not alone. This is a global battle. It is a global battle. I hope you'll pick it up. Thank you very much.